Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. It is the beginning of a new year for us. I don't know, I've been teaching since 1989, so it's been a while. I've got some practice, but every September I get kind of jittery about the beginning of the new year. And since this is my first time hosting a US-Japan program event, I'm feeling a bit of opening night jitters now, but I'm also very excited that we're getting the year of seminars going. So my name is David Howell. I am the Robert K. and Dale J. Weary Professor of Japanese History here at Harvard. And this academic year, I'm serving as the acting director of the program on US-Japan relations. I have known Ian Chong for quite a while. I can't remember how many years, but he was a graduate student at Princeton University when I taught there before coming to Harvard in 2010. So we've been friends for quite a long time.
21 years, actually.
21 years. So a relationship can have a beer in public now. Anyway, so it's great to see Ian back again. I've seen him in the US, in Cambridge, and also in Singapore, as well as in Princeton over these past 21 years. I'd also like to welcome the US-Japan program's 16 affiliates, who include postdoctoral fellows, visiting scholars, and practitioner associates. Could I ask our associates to stand briefly? Welcome. And then also, I'd like to do a little shout out for our US-Japan program staff, Megan Hodge, Zoom master today, among many other things, Pierce Langdon, the executive director, Shin Fujihira, and Sophie.
She's not here.
Oh, Sophie, and Sophie Welsh, who isn't able to be here today. And I should also say that we have a very exciting series of seminars planned for the fall semester. I won't go through them all, but I would like to highlight a couple that are coming up. The first is the next seminar in the series, which will actually be next week, Wednesday, rather than the usual Monday. So Wednesday, September 18th, from 12 to 1:15, across the street in room 020 in CJIS South. This is our usual room, but next week we'll meet across the street in CJIS South. And the session will feature Lieutenant General Koichi Isobe, retired, and the Boston University professor Thomas Berger, speaking on from the Tomodachi operation to the China challenge, new frontiers in US-Japan alliance cooperation. And so that's next week, Wednesday from 12 to 1:15. And then on November 4th, a day when I think many people in the United States will have sweaty palms and high anxiety, regardless of their political affiliations. That is the day before the presidential election. Professor Laura Hine of Northwestern University will speak on distant travels as methodology, Japan studies, and visual artist Tomiyama Taeko. Professor Hine is our program's distinguished visitor for the 2024-25 academic year. And let me finally briefly introduce today's moderator. Professor Mark Wu is the Henry L. Stimson Professor at the Harvard Law School. He specializes in international trade and international economic law and has published extensively on emerging economies, digital technologies, trade remedies, environment, and foreign investment. He, for the past couple of years, has been serving as the faculty director for the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here at Harvard, and he's the faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. He also serves on the US-Japan Program's Faculty Advisory Committee. So let me now turn things over to Mark, who will then introduce Ian Chong. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a pleasure to be here.
on behalf of the Faculty Advisory Committee, I especially want to extend a yokoso to all of the new associates. It's a real pleasure to have you all here. And for the students who are here in the room, I just want to draw your attention to the cohort that we have every year at the Program in US-Japan Relations of Associates. It's really some of the leading scholars and policymakers in a variety of different domains. So I urge you to take a look at their bios and to reach out to any who may be of interest to you. These are individuals for whom you might have a hard time getting on their calendar in Tokyo or other cities, but who are certainly available and interested in meeting with you all here. So I just want to urge you all to take advantage of their knowledge and their expertise while they're here for this year. Again, I just want to extend my welcome to the first seminar of this academic year of the Weatherhead program on the program US-Japan Relations. The seminar is co-sponsored not only by the institution for which I am the faculty director, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. It's also co-sponsored by the Asia Center, the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. And we are really delighted to welcome back Professor Ian Chong, who is a professor of political science at the National University of Singapore. And we're thrilled that he could join us right after an exciting weekend, an exhausting weekend, I think, in Philadelphia as part of the American Political Science Association's meetings. Ian, I think, needs no introduction for many of you here in this room, but for those of you who may not be familiar with his work, he has published widely on international relations theory, on security studies, on Chinese foreign policy, on international relations in the Asia Pacific, and especially given where he sits in Singapore, he's really married the theory of what's happening in international relations with actually the expertise in terms of what's actually happening in the region itself in practice. He's contributed to our understanding of the nexus of international and domestic politics across a variety of the different countries in which he studies, and influences of forces such as nationalism, great power competition on domestic politics in third countries. He also has very strong Harvard ties, so welcome back. He was a postdoctoral fellow in what was then called the Princeton Harvard China and the World program from 2008 to 2009. And he was a visiting fellow here at the Harvard Yenching Institute from 2019 to 2010. He's the author of numerous books. I'm just going to list a couple of them, one of which is External Intervention in the Politics of State Formation in China, Indonesia, and Thailand. That was published by Cambridge University Press, which received a 2013 Best Book Award from the International Security Studies section of the International Studies Association. His articles have appeared in a variety of different journals, including International Security, Asian Security, the Japanese Journal of Political Science, Contemporary Southeast Asia, the European Journal of International Relations, and so on. And we're delighted to have him here today to talk on a topic that I think is very much on the minds of many of us here at the Weatherhead Center, and that's thinking about the security order as it exists in the Asia Pacific today. And Ian is going to fill us in on his thoughts of the differences in divergence in views between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. In particular, Northeast Asia is for deterrence, while Southeast Asia is mostly, parentheses, for free riding. So Ian, welcome back to Harvard. Please join me in extending a warm welcome for our first speaker of this year.
Well, thank you, Mark and David, for your very kind introduction. I'm grateful for the program on US-China relations, Asia Center, Fairbanks Center, Belfer Center for extending the invitation and for having me here. It's really great to be back at Harvard, and thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules, especially at the start of the semester for being. So what I will be proposing today is okay, thanks. So what I'll be proposing today is this idea that Northeast Asia has mostly moved toward a deterrence mode. And for Southeast Asia, with the important exception of the Philippines, is really looking to free ride and on Northeast Asian efforts, but not really do very much else themselves in terms of trying to secure the status quo or the international order that they've, to be honest, benefited from quite significantly over the past decades. Let me give you some details to fill in. So I'm sure many of you, especially with the program on U.S.-Japan relations, are familiar with the hive of activity that is happening in Northeast Asia. There's the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral. There are efforts by Japan and the Philippines to move closer together. Japan is working quite a lot in terms of security ties with Australia, with the UK and Italy, and then for NATO, there's the Asia Pacific 4 sort of setup. So there's a lot of activity going on in Northeast Asia in terms of trying to work the security front, right? And a lot of this comes down to the tension that we now see in U.S. PRC relations. And that competitiveness seems to, at least potentially, threaten to unsettle the sort of system, the institutions, and the rules and norms that we've become quite familiar with, definitely since the end of the Cold War, but extending back arguably since the end of the Second World War. So there is, I suppose, a view that those institutions, those alliances are of value to keep. And the way that I think we see states in Northeast Asia sort of move to keep them is to try to deter what we might see as the sort of rising challenger, the PRC, from trying to change the status quo, from trying to sort of shift things in a way that is too unilateral, that doesn't sufficiently consult and work together with other actors in the region. Now, this presents a fairly interesting puzzle because at least if you look at the language that is coming out from Southeast Asia, there's that similar sort of tone about rules-based international order being important. There's that same language about how the status quo is important. As I'll show you in a little bit, you'll also see that a lot of the economics, right, that's built on a system that rests on this set of institutions and rules. However, with the exception of the Philippines, you don't see this sort of activity. I can't show you any pictures of this sort of activity from Southeast Asia because there seems to be a distinct disinterest, right? So what I'm going to try to do today is to try to tease out why some of these patterns of divergence are happening. So just to sort of give you a sense, so this is the language. I know it's really small, but I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with it. The sort of language coming out, the spirit of Camp David. There's the ASEAN-US Special Summit, the joint vision. If you compare the two, there's that similarity in language about order, about status quo, about institutions, right? So the language is one thing, the behavior seems somewhat different. And when I mean behavior, one of the things that's pretty obvious is if you look at military expenditure, right? This has a, yeah. So Singapore and Brunei are sort of outliers. They're small, they have small populations, so you have to account for the fact that it's overhead. But apart from Singapore and Brunei, what you see is that there is an increase in per capita spending from Northeast Asia, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and for much of Southeast Asia, it's basically flatlining, right? So in terms of states, putting their money where their mouth is in terms of trying to build up defensive capability to discourage, the use of force, right? There isn't that same kind of investment from Southeast Asia compared to Northeast Asia, Singapore and Brunei notwithstanding because of the overheads and their size. Now, if you look at the way that trade works, right? What you find is that for Northeast Asia and largely Southeast Asia, things look very much the same when we're considering the proportion of trade with the PRC. So essentially, it's the proportion of trade stands at about 20 to 30%. But I think what is also interesting about Southeast Asia compared to Northeast Asia is, with the exception of Japan, most the other two Northeast Asian states They run a trade surplus with the PRC, but in Southeast Asia, with the exception of Laos and Myanmar, although the Myanmar data is obviously very sort of strange now, and Brunei with its oil and gas, they're running trade deficits with the PRC. I mean, there's a reason for this, and it comes down to the way that these economies are very much embedded in the world economy. They will buy stuff from the PRC that they will finish and sell to the world market. So that's what I think accounts for the trade deficit. So being part of this whole sort of economic circulation, creates a lot of incentive and a lot of reason to maintain the open international trading system, the WTO system, and also at sea, things like UNCLOS that keep the regulation of shipping sort of relatively predictable and safe, right? And also to sort of manage, not necessarily resolve, but to manage territorial disputes. In terms of value, this gives us a very similar kind of a picture. I don't want to belabor the point. Essentially, the Northeast Asian economies are much bigger. Now, numerically, what you see too, I think I just want to touch on this very briefly because there's quite a lot of talk about how Southeast Asia is supposedly dependent on the PRC for trade. In terms of trade in goods, the PRC is the largest trading partner in terms of value, but you'll find that all Southeast Asian states, they will trade more with each other collectively than actually with the PRC. And if we're looking at balanced trade, again, this just underscores the point I was saying. There's a surplus within Southeast Asia and a chronic deficit with the PRC. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That just is how the economy works. And you buy from the PRC to sort of process and sell elsewhere. Now, the other thing that is, I think, quite interesting is if you look at FDI, there's a lot of talk about the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative. But interestingly, the PRC is not the largest foreign investor in Southeast Asia. That would be the EU, followed by the US, Japan. And if you look at the ROK, they're not that far from the PRC in terms of FDI. So part of this has to do with the fact that when you consider how FDI from the PRC works, right? It goes into large infrastructure, everybody sees it, shiny new trains and things like that. Whereas if you have investment coming from Japan or the US, they go to some factory in some industrial area where no one really sees, they will hire people and create jobs to be sure. But the way that those effects get felt is when these people, having earned their salaries, then go spend it elsewhere. It's not as visible, it's not as tangible in as direct a manner. Okay, so just to sort of underscore some of the sort of shared basic positions that Southeast Asian states and Northeast Asian states have. I mean, I think that trade and that investment picture tries to draw some of it. But if you think about how trade actually works, right? Trade in goods, not in services, moving stuff, from one place to the other. Here, you find that with shipping, basically Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, they're very much tied to each other. So physically, right, moving stuff is important. If you think about moving people and sort of air freight, you get a pretty similar picture. That's Japan there. I think the sort of geography doesn't look as clear. But beyond that, if you consider, if you consider sort of online, links via the internet, this chart I think is sort of interesting. If you look at how Northeast Asia connects to the rest of the world, especially to South Asia, Europe, Middle East, these submarine cables will basically connect, Northeast Asia to that part of the world. So what this means is that your financial information, any of your commercial ordering, if you're doing R&D work, your designs, right, they pass through these submarine cables. So that means to say that for Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, there should be, right, a lot more congruence in the way that they view the world. And if they believe, as they say they do, right, that keeping the world order, making sure there's no unilateral change, if they say that's important, then this distinction, right, in behavior in terms of investment in the defense and deterrence stuff, and the sort of building of defense and security type relationships, it's sort of odd that they're trending in different directions. So why is this the case? That's all of the graphics that I have to show you, but I'll also talk about why this is the case. So I think there's several reasons for this. One is, of course, the Northeast Asian states are embedded in much stronger relations with primarily the US in security terms. Even for Taiwan, which doesn't have a formal security relationship with the US anymore, it's a strong security partner. And so there's a lot more confidence in that relationship and those sets of relationships. And because of the sort of US role, I think there's a lot more commonality for them to speak with each other. Plus, I think the experience of the previous Trump administration suggested to many of these Northeast Asian actors that they have to probably work together a little bit more, especially at moments when the US might seem a little distracted, where the US might seem to be a little less committed to maintaining order and maintaining institutions. So that's sort of the Northeast Asia story. For the Southeast Asia story, what is going on is, on the one hand, it's a lot, economies there, they are, far more competitive with each other. The polities there, they are far less tied in a sort of formal sense to the sort of US security architecture, with the exception of the Philippines and maybe Thailand. The two of them are security allies. Now, I think for Southeast Asia as well, the other thing that we are facing is a situation where there's far less. There's ASEAN, but there's far less investment in ASEAN, in building up ASEAN as a robust institutional order, right? And so under these circumstances, I think there's a belief that, okay, since you're far weaker, you can't really do that much, then what you might want to do is to sort of, stand back a little bit, hope that the Northeast Asian states and maybe plus the US can be effective in deterrence and maintaining the status quo that way. Right? And that means also that you're not bearing the cost of a lot of that deterring work. It also means that you can actually reap, but while you reap the benefits. But at the same time, it means that you can turn around to Beijing and say, look, I'm not doing the stuff that these sort of nasty Northeast Asian states are doing. We'd like to really be friends, and you can benefit economically from that. So that it really is, I think, I would argue, a clear free-riding type of behavior. And I think they can also Southeast Asian states can also turn around and say, okay, if you don't want us to move in the direction that Northeast Asia is, and perhaps the Philippines, I'll talk about the Philippines in just one moment, then you need to be much nicer to us. So that's, I think, the calculus that's going on in Southeast Asia. The Philippines is an exception because I think, like the Northeast Asian states, they find themselves in more direct competition or no more direct pressure from the PRC because of the territorial disputes, because of the fact also that geographically the Philippines is right next to Taiwan, and after the Nancy Pelosi visit, they realized that sort of old thinking that what stays in Taiwan, what happens around Taiwan stays around Taiwan, what happens in the East China Sea and Northeast Asia stays there. I think the Philippines realized that geographically they can't tell themselves that anymore. That's an easier story to sell, though, for the rest of Southeast Asia. Hence, you see the Philippines becoming much more engaged. They're thinking a lot more about getting involved in a lot of the sort of deterrent efforts. Some of it by themselves, but a lot of it also in terms of working with partners like Japan, in terms of stepping up their relationship with the US in terms of having pre-positioning and moving towards closer defense ties. They're also working with the Australians. That's not a situation that Thailand, also a US treaty ally, finds itself in, so it doesn't have to do a lot of this. It's complicated also by the fact of Thailand's own domestic politics, where there seems to be at least for the conservatives who are on top for the moment, they are a lot tied with PRC interests, but that's a domestic story that complicates the picture but doesn't quite change the story. So I think that accounts for some of that divergence. So what if there's this divergence? I think the implications are sort of worth walking through for a second. One is, I think, in terms of a sort of individual state basis, I suppose if you're somewhere from Southeast Asia, if you're Singapore or you're Malaysia, sure, your short-term interest would be the free ride. You get a lot of benefit out of it. You reduce your risk. So that makes total sense. It's completely reasonable. I think for the Northeast Asian states, the way that friction has been growing with the PRC makes those kinds of propositions perhaps less likely, and hence you have to think about perhaps more robust kinds of deterrence type actions. So what that means as well is that for Southeast Asia, a lot will ride on a deterrence working. If you are interested in maintaining the order, deterrence can fail, like any policy, it can fail. Another is if you want to continue working with the PRC and the US and US allies and friends, you're assuming then that there is sufficient policy space for you, that you won't get punished by one side or the other, or both sides, right, for seeming like you're not sufficiently supportive or committed. So that's a sort of a second assumption that's out there. There's of course a possibility that these assumptions might get violated at some point. We don't know when. And the third implication to think about is if for Southeast Asia you believe that system maintenance, keeping the status quo is important, then by withholding your active support, you're actually putting less resources into that system maintenance. It's your pretty classic collective action problem, right? You have a sort of collective good that you're seeking, but different actors that might cooperate have a lot of reason to sort of pursue other parochial interests. And in doing so, you actually may undermine the sort of overall longer term objective that you're seeking. I mean, this of course gets into some of the timing consistency stuff as well, right? You're seeking to maximize your short-term gains, and you're sort of leveraging your longer-term sort of gains for that. So those are some of those issues that are facing Southeast Asia. And of course, with this sort of collective action problem, it also means that efforts at deterrence may actually be less effective, right? Because you have actors not all pulling in the same direction. Now, of course, that's just for the sort of deterrent bit, assuming that it could work. There's also the risk, of course, that we could get deterrence wrong. As many of you well know, deterrence is the careful calibration of credible threat and credible assurance. Now, there is a chance that as Northeast Asia finds that it has to sort of pull more weight and invest a lot more in trying to discourage unilateral changes to the status quo, that could inadvertently go overboard, right? That could end up threatening instead of assuring. You might get the calibration wrong. And that could then spur, of course, a greater potential, a greater risk of confrontation with the PRC. That indirectly, right, draws from the fact that, not everyone is pulling in the same direction. So I guess the sort of point I wanted to bring across in this presentation is really that it's the Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia dynamic when it comes to looking at US PRC competition. They share a lot of interest, but it's a pretty typical example of how collective action problems play out, and it also creates, I think, it changes the sort of risk dynamic in many ways. It's not to say that, because Southeast Asia is looking at a sort of short-term gain, they're out of the woods, or that Northeast Asia, because they're looking at deterrence, they have the solution. It's something that they probably would benefit more from working together, but unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case. And that will, I think, complicate matters in terms of dealing with US PRC ties, especially if we believe that US PRC friction is going to be quite persistent. So these are issues I think that are worth putting on the table and worth considering. I just also want to quickly caveat that if you go to Southeast Asia often, they will tell you that they're hedging and they're trying to do multiple things at the same time. But for one, that hedging behavior does sort of pull, it means that they're not, investing in the deterrence bit as much, or at least if they are, the sort of credibility of their commitment can be questioned. The other is sometimes with this hedging discussion, I think it's useful to sort of ask ourselves what hedging looks like. It's hard to delimit where it starts and where it begins, for one. And another, if we think that hedging is a strategy and it represents what we're seeing in Southeast Asia, then it would be useful to consider conditions under which hedging might fail. Not to say that we want it to fail, but just like every strategy, we know what deterrence failure looks like, right? We should also be thinking about what failure for all these other strategies might look like as well. So yes, on that happy note, I'm cognizant of time, and let me stop here and invite your questions. Thank you.
So Ian, thank you very much for that. I think our tradition here is I'll give a couple minutes of response and then I'll turn it to one of our fellows. And you're welcome to keep standing, but you're welcome to take a seat, whatever you would prefer. I want to just respond by asking you a few questions, and they tie in your expertise, particularly to look at domestic politics. So the question that I want to toss out to you is, I think there's two different ways we can think about the difference between domestic politics between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, right? So one way in which one could challenge your hypothesis is to say it's simply just the political cycles are off or different timing in Northeast Asia versus Southeast Asia. And it just so happens that in Northeast Asia, we have relatively hawkish pro-American political parties in place, but that when it swings back towards a more liberal, or in the case of Taiwan, a more pro-KMT type of policy, we might see this type of divergence in the election cycles being off in Southeast Asia. But I think if that were not the case, right, I think there's two possible things which could hold true that explains the difference in political cycles. So I'm curious if one or both of these, in your opinion, holds true. One is just to simply argue to think about the way that democracies function in Northeast Asia is different than in Southeast Asia when it comes to domestic politics, where in Southeast Asia, perhaps the democracies are more captured by certain elites or perhaps not quite as institutionally robust as in different parts of Northeast Asia. And also the military is much more directly entwined with politics than is the case in Northeast Asia. And that would then posit that in Southeast Asia, possibly the elites and the militaries who are aligned with being a political force have stronger PRC ties, that the PRC is able to buy that off in a way that they cannot do so in the ROK, Japan, or in Taiwan. So that's first, right? The second would simply to argue that the role of domestic responses and the PRC issue just plays out differently in Northeast Asia than it does in Southeast Asia. And in particular, the history of conflicts and the perception that there may actually be a direct conflict as opposed to the business gains might differ in Northeast Asia than it does in Southeast Asia, particularly in Northeast Asia being a bit more advanced in the supply chain, sees themselves now as more directly in competition and less synergistic. But also possibly the technology flows contributing much more to direct risk than Southeast Asia does. So that would be a second type of hypothesis. So I just wanted to ask you to respond to both of those, whether you think both might be doing some work, one does more work than the other, and so forth, just to elaborate on your thesis here a little bit more. And then the other questions I just wanted to toss out are a little bit less with regard to your thesis, but much more with regard to the pragmatic part that I highlighted of your work. The question I think on the minds of some in the United States is, how much did the lack of a robust response by the United States to the build out in the South China Sea matter in terms of how Southeast Asia sees this differently than Northeast Asia, and in Southeast Asia adopting a more hedging type of policy? And then the third question that I'll leave is to say, if you were to advise any of the leaders in any of these states, including the United States, but also in Northeast Asia, Australia, even the European Union, about trying to get Southeast Asia or particular states in Southeast Asia off of a more free-riding hedging type of policy and actually more on board with the deterrence policy. What advice, if any, would you have, or given the factors that you've highlighted, and particularly the importance of domestic politics, is it really not necessarily feasible given the domestic political constraints that you've often highlighted in your own work as driving foreign policy, security policy? So I'll leave it there for you to think over and respond, but also let me turn it over to one of our fellows this year, Professor Suzuki Kazutoshi from Sophia University, to ask a follow-up set of questions. Professor Suzuki is a faculty member in the Faculty of Global Studies, and so he focuses on international economic networks and national bargaining power. So your work is very much in conversation with his. So Professor Suzuki.
Thank you. I'm Toshi Suzuki from Sophia University, and I'm now associated with US-Japan program. And I have the honor to ask you the first question. And well, thank you for your interesting presentation on this pivotal issue. And as you have pointed out, ASEAN countries and East Asian democracies seem to have different degrees of security commitment. And what do you think is the impact? How great is the impact of the ASEAN norm? That is to say, historically, Southeast Asian nations have been trying not to take sides. And Thailand had the example of success in the colonial era. And Singapore is doing the same thing. And how much the known or common understandings of the international politics matters in the attitude of the ASEAN nations.
Right. I guess I respond. So moving from top to the bottom, I'll try to do this quite quickly, is I think, yes, I agree that domestic politics matters. I think as well, it's important to recognize that in Northeast Asia, the democratic systems there are a lot more mature and robust than for most of Southeast Asia. That having been said, I think the position that we find in Northeast Asia, isn't that just that these sort of governments sort of naturally sort of came out and decided they wanted to be hawkish. It was from the over the past decade and a half, I would argue. The sort of back and forth with the PRC did create a lot of reason for suspicion and tension that might speak to some of the supply chains and technology issues that Mark had pointed out. But that having been said, I think that those sorts of dynamics aren't completely absent from Southeast Asia. So, but maybe it's a little bit more recent, but with some of the PRC's efforts at their dual circulation made in China 2025 and to really focus on exporting, that's put a lot of pressure on places like Thailand and Indonesia in terms of their own homegrown industry. So that's why you see them sort of trying to put on tariffs and all that as well. So there's some of that. Plus, I think if you think about the diversification especially the diversification post-COVID, a lot of that is going to Southeast Asia. So there is more of a competitive dynamic but there, I suppose, how the domestic politics play out it gets to very local things, not just the military and the elites, because I think the story about the militaries being powerful, that I think would apply to Thailand. You could argue that it would apply to Indonesia, but the military doesn't have that same sort of a role in, say, the Philippines. In Vietnam, clearly that's a party state, and it's very much party-driven. The militaries in Singapore and Malaysia are quite depoliticized. So the good thing with Southeast Asia is we have a lot of variation. So if you look across the variation, it seems to sort of cancel out, I would argue, some of these effects, except for the very local sort of politics about, for instance, just to give you an example, we talked very briefly about Thailand, but I think Malaysia is a very good example, where recently you see a lot of effort by the Anwar Ibrahim government to tack closer to the PRC. Some of that is this expectation that there'll be economic opportunity, but some of it is also as events in Gaza unfold and Anwar is afraid of being flanked by the conservative group in his country, the more he has to seem like he is, standing against the US. So that domestic element is fairly important, but that might, going down that route means we have to sort of look more at a sort of country to country comparison. We can do that later if you like, but not to belabor that point, on pragmatism, I think for a lot of, speaking with Southeast Asian states, I think so far there's a belief that they can get away with the free riding. I suppose if there's need to convince them to do otherwise, there has to be some case to be made to say, look, if you do want to maintain a status quo, as you say you do, then you probably need to pitch in a little, right? Maybe not necessarily the same way. It doesn't mean that you have to choose sides, but you have to be more robust in your institution building. And that might actually become important, or particularly important, depending on what happens this November in the US. So if the US becomes less committed, then then states in the region will probably have to invest a lot more, which then I guess gets me to some of Professor Suzuki's points. So the ASEAN norm of not taking sides, I think that worked and will work if we believe that the US and the PRC are both fairly status quo. They don't really challenge the situation, the situation, and if they allow states to sort of have this sort of wavering position. As competition intensifies, it's not necessarily the case that either or both major powers will continue to allow for that accommodation. And so what I would argue Southeast Asia needs to do is that it probably needs to take sides, not between the US and China, but it needs to take sides in terms of investing in its own institutions, in its own processes, because one of the issues that ASEAN is faced with now, it talks a lot about centrality, but its efforts to deal with things, regional things like Myanmar has been very limited. Its ability to deal with the South China Sea types of issues have been really limited because basically the maritime Southeast Asian states and the mainland Southeast Asian states see things differently, and they have difficulty trying to like trade and help each other out. So there needs to be, I think, some institutional investment. And on the sort of not choosing sides success bits, yes, I mean, Thailand has historically had that reputation, but during the Cold War, they were a pretty staunch US ally. They don't have to go there again, but they may have to do more institution building. Singapore, the same thing. There's a lot of lip service paid to non-alignment, but during the Cold War, it was clear that they had a certain leaning. Maybe that's what is needed. I'm not saying that it necessarily needs to be the case, but those things should be on the table for discussion, rather than to sort of pretend that things, would just sort of go along. So ASEAN centrality ends up looking more like a donut hole than, anything that is sort of substantive.
Right, so the floor is open for questions. Do you want to call?
Oh, sure. Gentleman at the back in the purple shirt.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Stephen Hollis, I'm a graduate student in international relations here in Harvard, so we work very important. For the country of the Philippines, like you said, contributed to the status quo as far as not really economic or military power. Would you say that the domestic pressures to convert more to a higher rule of law, more in internal domestic security, as far as rebel forces that are separatists from the government, would you say that that's on the table and or actually possible? Or would it be that the United States would have to assist in such a great way that it's almost out of the administration?
Okay, I'll collect some questions so we can get more of them. The lady in front of you.
Yes, this is Christiana, my director of program of conservation. I want to draw on what you said, ask about the need to think that the way, I guess, of investing in the institutions, investing in its own institutions, in its own capacity. And I was wondering if the concept of strategic autonomy is in the region, because autonomy, so we don't want to be single, So
Okay, let me take these two first. So on the Philippines, I think it's quite interesting that the if you look at the Philippines across time, because they've experimented with different things. So if you look at the Arroyo administration, they were trying to work with the PRC. And then you look at the Aquino administration, they tried to, because of the territorial disputes, they tried to take a legal route. Well, they first tried to work with PRC, it didn't work. Tried to take the legal route. The PRC basically didn't care very much for it. The Duterte administration really tried to embrace the PRC to see whether things would get better. Apparently it didn't. So we have the Marcos administration, trying to be a little bit more robust. Now, the way that they've done it, in part, is to work with the US and sort of bring more capabilities in, but they've had a change in strategy too that so far has mixed results. That sort of radical transparency thing that they've been doing in terms of highlighting every sort of challenge, especially every risky challenge that you see on the South China Sea. That's, I mean, it's sort of a weapons of the weak kind of an approach. It has some effect. We see that the frequency of PRC challenges have increased. We see that the we see the also the geographical scope has expanded. But, and this is an important point, the intensity of escalation has not. So if you think about what the PRC had been doing between 2012 and 2016, they used to ram ships to sink them. They used to detain crew and detain vessels. They can, capability-wise, still do it, but they're not. So I think there's recognition that some of this transparency stuff and the need to at least have some sort of degree of proportionality and legitimacy, that's altered behavior somewhat. So I mean those are other possibilities apart from just the capability questions. Although your last point about the domestic politics and the separatist group, that's useful. I think after the whole Malawi incident, the fact that the domestic opposition is less of a concern now, the separatist stuff is less of a concern now, allows for a shift in focus to some of the external stuff. And the Armed Forces of the Philippines have been saying this, that they want to now refocus on the external security stuff. So that's on strategic autonomy and capacity building. I think we're pretty much on the same page there. I think this is what Southeast Asia wants to do. Right, but the issue, it's a sort of collective action problem embedded in the collective action problem. Southeast Asian states are pretty populous in and of themselves. Many of them, Indonesia is what, 270 million people. Philippines is what, like 100 million, and Vietnam is like 90 million. But next to the PRC, they're all fairly small. So what they need to do is to actually work together. But if you have a situation where the mainland Southeast Asian states feel that, well, I'm not getting any support on the Mekong issues because all you maritime states are worried about the South China Sea. So, what reason do I have to sort of pitch in? And the maritime Southeast Asian states say, well, we're going to focus on the South China Sea stuff, and the Mekong stuff we're just going to put on hold. Well, on one level, that's not going to work. There are the different levels of economic development that the different Southeast Asian states are at. So as long as they don't resolve this collective action problem, then their ability to band together and maybe collectively bargain and have that strategic autonomy via both Beijing and Washington will be more limited. So this is what I mean by they need to also invest a lot on themselves. They need to choose themselves, which they're not doing right now. The concept is used, but again, it's one of these things like with the status quo bits. It's thrown out there, but if you look at behavior to follow up with the language, it's not there so much. Here and
sorry. Hi, my name is Koichi Nakano, also from the US Japan program. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, but I'm a little bit struck by the fact that on one hand, you concede that deterrence is not objective, but at the same time, the language that you use in condemning Southeast Asian countries and rewriting is very, very strong. And I was also confused whether you are kind of taking this sort of liberal institutionalist stance and scolding Southeast Asian countries for not doing enough, or you are embracing realist perspective in talking about collective action problems and all that sort of thing. Because to me, it seems to make perfect sense to rewrite as you put it.
Mhm.
The fact that China may be threatening the US as the regional hegemon, and Southeast Asian countries like much of Northeast Asia too, and China, is not going to be the hegemon. And so trying to see what works best seems to make complete sense. And but to put it like it's a stark choice between either strengthening the militarization and confronting China with more deterrence power on the one hand, or else, because you could also very well turn into a battlefield. And for the people and the leaders of these countries not want to have wars fought on the ground seems to make entire sense, particularly if they benefit economically from the current state of affairs. And the reason why I ask these questions partly because I have a deep disagreement of perspective. But at the same time, it seems to be, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to show up. You say rules-based order, but we live in a time when that concept is very much questioned. What's happening in the Middle East, and the US. Even at this point, very much possible that Trump will be back in power. And isn't Trump a bigger threat to the rules-based order, wherever you define it? And so the idea that we all have to keep up the militarization and side with the United States and keeping the middle ground, trying to see where things go and trying not to have to choose between the US and China, something that is morally wrong almost, seems to be very, very strong and biased.
So amid the, I'm Susan Farr, Government Department. In all the alliance building and shifting in the region, one of the formations that emerged was the Quad. And the Quad is actually quite an interesting formation because it brings in Australia, which is a tiny country, and India, which is, for many countries in the region, they've thought of it as sort of out of region. And from the standpoint of Southeast Asia, in the same way that Japan used to talk about Japan passing, you could say it's Southeast Asia passing. It was also framed initially as an arc of democracy, which created a sense of sort of us democracies and other, this other category. So I'm interested in how you think it's affected the kind of calculations you've been talking about. You could see in some ways it would lead Southeast Asia to want to get more in the game if these other odd ducks are brought into these kinds of regional arrangements. Or you could see it just incentivizing, increasing the incentives to free ride because you've got more countries now anteing up and helping with deterrence.
Okay, thank you. So I guess where I'm coming, I don't put a normative frame on free riding. It's perfectly rational behavior. I also tend not to sort of see things in realist liberal type frames. Collective action problems are as much liberal questions as they are realist ones. So what I will say though is that if we look at the way that the economies work, you require a certain degree of stability and the expectation of stability. You require clearer rules of the road. You require clearer ways to manage and perhaps resolve disputes without resort to the use of force. If that is the case, then you might say I'm liberal institutionalist, but I think if you think that institutions matter, if you think that institutions don't matter, that's a different story. But if you think that institutions matter, then they need to be invested in. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to find yourself in a security alliance with the US. You can't just invest in institutions because you say they've worked for you over the past decades and you want to keep things that way. And if you have a uncommitted US because of a Trump administration, perhaps even the more so, you need to build on these institutions because then the investment in institutions from the US may be less forthcoming. And if you think they're of value, you probably may need to do more. Again, not necessarily that you side with the US, but you need to invest in what you say that you think, what you say is meaningful, which gets to Professor Farr's question, which is, there is, I think, a greater incentive to free ride if you see more actors pitching in. But by sort of going with the free riding, what you're also ceding, right, is your autonomy and your own imprint. You're basically saying, I don't want to, have my voice in the whole institution strengthening and building game. I'm just going to let other people do it, which means that the rules that come out on the other side, the arrangements come out on the other side, may not have your input. This is where the Southeast Asia passing, I think, has significant consequence, which is going back to our early conversation about strategic autonomy. That's what you want to have strategic autonomy for. It's not for its own sake, but for you to be able to collectively bargain, for you to shape the kind of future that you think is important. You won't get everything you want, but at least if you're in the room, you're able to have some of that shaping effect, which I think the disarray within Southeast Asia prevents at this point in time. So the more so, like if you have a big actor like India you want to make your voice heard.
I think we have time for one quick last question, if anyone has a burning question.
Well, why don't you take this through very, very quickly?
Shastra that I'm the engineers to do.
Go ahead.
I would like you to answer Professor Mark's question about Southeast Asian states' response, actually sort of stemming from American lack of response to Chinese infrastructure building in South China Sea. And the second
all
one
right.
is, the second one is to
Just one question because we have to collect. Okay, ma'am.
University, I want to ask, how do you think domestic political structure and responsive in Southeast Asia shape their approach to democracy, military intervention, and strategic advancement, particularly in relation to managing the PRC influence? And do you think that one region approach there more effectiveness than the other?
Okay. Shin?
That's all right.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, because I'm watching the clock. I think you're right. So the lack of a U.S. response to the PRC infrastructure building, that I think has played a role in terms of creating questions about U.S. commitment. But if the various Southeast Asian claimants are not willing to give up on these claims, then the question is, okay, what are you going to do to pursue these claims, right? If the US is not going to be doing very much, what are you going to do yourself? Because it is your claim. And we sometimes in Southeast Asia hear interlocutors from Washington say, look, if you're not willing to stand up for your own interests, then there's very little reason why the US should do that on your behalf, right? So it's a bit of a chicken egg game, but I think that sort of lack of response probably needs to be thought through, but right now it seems like it's a bit of a buck passing situation that's going on. With regard to the domestic political structure, I think where things play the biggest role is the fact that the Northeast Asian states, and perhaps plus the Philippines, they are systems that are more open to public pressure. So when you have public sentiment sort of figure that there is pressure coming from the PRC. There is also a sense of nationalism in these various places as well, including the Philippines. So I think politicians there have to be more responsive to these kinds of public pressures. I would argue that's the case with Taiwan too. It's less the case in places where elites basically can call the shots. You can disregard public sentiment more easily. So I think that is part of the dynamic, but of course the details, the devil will be in the details when you look at every specific state. But in general, I would say that might be the configuration. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Again, a quick reminder, our next program is next week on the 18th with Lieutenant General Isobe. And so please join me in extending a warm thanks and appreciation for all of this great food for thought on deterrence to Professor Chong.